So, Nathan,
Yes.
I've got a wild idea. Are you thinking what I'm thinking?
Oh, of course.
I think that we record ourselves talking about D&D instead of just talking about D&D for our own benefit. We record it and then post it on YouTube.
What a strangely unique and never thought of before idea, sir.
Right? Right? I feel really good about it. It's so crazy it just might work.
It just might work.
All the names that suggest excellence are taken, I think.
We could be the fumbling failures.
I don't have the most self-esteem. It's probably best to conserve what's left. We are all natural, and there's two of us. We're not 20. We're not critical success.
I think there's a show pretty close to that name, by the way.
Yeah, roll a crit or something like that.
Yeah, something like that. It's pretty. I think some people follow it.
Natural two.
Natural too. I think that's fitting.
So what should we talk about first?
Well, I guess we can talk about what we do practically every week between our games, and that is indulging both you and I's need and fascination to play more D&D than any reasonable human being should.
One night is just not enough. Uh, I'm looking for that long-term commitment.
Hmm.
You might say it's what I'm thinking of. I need a way to play D&D when I'm not playing D&D. And you have gone above and beyond to facilitate that.
Yeah, I definitely didn't need to pile more workload on top of my DM prep, but the results that we have gotten from our various outings are hopefully worth it.
We've never talked about making any of that available publicly. That's always been just for the gang,
Hmm.
for our own fleshing out of our world. But if we're going to talk about it, it almost seems like we're obligated to give people a peek.
Yeah, if only there was some sort of wiki-based system for my world that also has various stories and manuscripts attached to it. That might be a fabulous idea, sir.
Something for the description, perhaps.
Mm.
A link. Yeah, it's underneath the bell and the thumbs up button.
Hmm. Does the bell really matter anymore? I hear that that's an outdated plea for approval.
I mean, if you see a bell, how can you not ring it? Like if you walk into a space, if you go to a hotel now that the zombie apocalypse is winding down, and see one of those ding-a-lings on the counter, do you really not want to smash it?
Better yet, in a D&D context, picture a party entering a room with nothing but a bell. I don't think it'd be long before that bell was rung.
Would it, or would there be a 2.5 hour conversation about, guys, we can't touch that
Can I
bell?
incite the bell, please?
Yeah,
The situation that we are involved in is I am the DM of a, I guess, long-term game is what you refer to it as. Our game's been going for a year and a half at this point. James is a player in this campaign and very much one of the players that thoroughly enjoys the world and not just the story, which is a godsend as a DM. The best way, as far as my experience, to play D&D between sessions is to do little written short stories or write-ups or descriptions. And while you can do this by yourself pretty effectively, like if you were doing a character's backstory, it is enhanced by having a second person participating in that, whether it's the DM or another player, which I think doing it with another player, writing that is the less like familiar or regularly used aspect of this.
at least the less talked about,
Yeah,
from
yeah.
what I can see.
Hmm.
Our desire, I like to think it's not just me, to keep playing even when we're not playing. Uh, the idea, I would almost describe it as like instead of just writing your character's backstory and then throwing that away, forgetting about it, never looking at it again, never going through that exercise again. It's just something you do for session zero and then uh it's over. I feel like you could think of it as constantly evolving backstory. Like you're writing new, you're updating the backstory in between what's happening in session.
But there is a lot of transactions that I've seen you and the other players have between each other in either our Discord downtime or actual one-on-one write-ups that really help cement the relationship that the characters have in game. Whereas when you're put on the spot in a session and you're forced to come up with this like dialogue between two people naturally, it can help, but also can hurt where things are miscommunicated or the exact response that you wanted doesn't quite come across. So that's what I like to see whenever you guys, talking about the players, do a write up or do some sort of deep dive, is it allows thought out depth to occur versus the kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Improv that you normally have to do to make these relationships work.
The literary term, I need to get some glasses without any lenses that I can push up on my nose. A literary term could be subtext.
Mm-hmm.
It creates more deeper meaning behind some of those conversations that take place during session. Because you've just got, I mean, here we've in doing this, we have we doubled the shared sort of history uh of the characters and of the world through this. Like I'm not saying there's literally double the content. It's not like there's, another 100 hours of stuff that isn't on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
But just there again, just the subtext and the relationships that don't make sense or might even be kind of boring for other people to try to play out and form all over Roll20,
Mm-hmm.
but make perfect sense for this more slow-paced, thoughtful exercise.
Yeah, I think one of the really big benefits of doing something like this is you can really kind of get self-indulgent to a degree. Like if you're a player that really enjoys your character, which every player should, mind you, then it's difficult sometimes to not have the spotlight or to not be actively involved in what's going on in the game, or at least kind of like tampering down some of your main character syndrome, because I think everyone has that to an extent. So when you do write-ups like this or exchanges with another person where the focus is either directly on your character or your character in kind of a side problem or incident, it allows you to scratch that itch that otherwise would just kind of get tossed to the side.
And there's I've seen more discussion about uh, playing as a duet or one-on-one D&D,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel like for in the interest, I love that idea, and I've done that. It's one of my favorite ways to play, uh, except for all the other ways to play. But in the interest of narrowing our focus, this isn't quite that. Like, we're not using a battle map. The dice rolling has been minimal, although we'll talk more about that, I think,
Mm-hmm.
about why that has been or whether that's something that could change. It's a lot more for nerding out over story, over role play, or really looking at a relationship between two characters with a microscope.
What drives you to come to me or come to another player and go, hey, I want to do this? Because I know from a DM side that I'm just almost like blanket accepting or approving of any concept that's thrown my way. Because I'm always excited to dig deeper into things or explain things or do a bunch of lore dumping that I don't usually get to do. But from a player's aspect, what drives you to, instead of just being like, oh, that'd be a fun idea, to actually like going for it and asking someone to flesh this entire thing out with you?
So uh, in the first place, am definitely not kidding about looking for ways to play when we're not playing.
Hmm.
It is D&D is my A1 hobby, and I'm not gonna get into that tiresome stuff of like, I'm an adult with responsibilities. Like, nobody wants to hear that. We can't play 24 hours a day.
Sadly.
Uh, so this keeps that drip feed going, and also keeps the energy up between sessions for me.
Hmm.
Um, it really cuts down on that feeling of like sitting down on game night and thinking like, wait, what were we doing? In the second place, I am a role player's role player, if I say so myself. I really climb inside any whatever character I play. I That's the big part of the fun for me is um doing my level best to make this individual real. So I'm always thinking about what, when they got back from that horrible fight where they almost died, what did the rest of his night look like? How did he unwind? Or if he had a chance to really tell this person what was on his mind, what would he say? And I don't remember since joining this group and joining your game, I don't remember which one of us said something first about doing it.
I can't remember what our first write up was, to be honest. We've done a lot of them at this point.
Well, so I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent. We had been doing a lot of world building back and forth.
Yeah.
You would ask me questions about my dude, and I would answer them, and then I would get an idea and say, hey, as Lord of the Universe, is there room for this concept
Hmm.
in my character's uh sort of space? And I I, I want to say that it just sort of evolved out of that, and it was
Yeah.
like, instead of this passive sort of sending notes back and forth, let's just let's just write.
I think that's probably a whole other topic that we could have a very lengthy conversation about, just centralizing around players fleshing out a world versus just the DM. This is a concept that I really like, and I really want to have it be more prevalent in the D&D or tabletop role-playing community, because so often you find that it's like the players are, oh, it's the DM's world, it's the DM's baby, I don't want to touch it, I don't want to mess anything up. But it is so much more colorful to have players deciding some rather minor or major points about your world. I think the majority of our earlier conversations was all around folk, which is the kingdom that your character comes from. And while the party had never been there yet, we hadn't explored that part of the world yet in the campaign, you and I were fleshing it out in the background. You know, discussing how certain different social events could be handled, the various,
Cultural
yeah,
mores and
yeah.
yeah.
So that just eventually evolved into actually writing out more specific details or a more personalized view of it. So that's that might be the best way to approach something like this if you are bringing it to a group that doesn't normally do something in this regard. Like if you play in a game that just shows up once a week and have some good times and then basically disperse before the next session comes around, I imagine it would be somewhat difficult to slip this idea in there. But if you present it to your DM or potentially even another player as, let me lighten the world building load, or let me help like clarify some details that we haven't gone over, that might be a good way to introduce it to someone who potentially is a little bit hesitant on it at first.
That's a great point. And uh for me, it's some concentrated dorkiness to get me through the week, but it would also be, like you're describing, a great way to give somebody some training wheels. I have seen discussion online on a regular basis. How do I get my players to roleplay? How do I get them to think in character? How do I get them to have characters that are more than their combat abilities? I've got a new player that doesn't that's ever roleplayed before, on and on and on. And there's a lot of anxiety when you're at the table face to face to improvise conversation and behavior, uh, to say nothing of actually making it like compelling and good.
Hmm.
So this would be a way to explore that in a much lower pressure circumstance.
A somewhat personal example in our game that I think would help kind of frame what you're talking about is if we're speaking of Thor, which is a character in our campaign who is the somewhat stereotypical, dumb, goofy kind of Goliath barbarian figure. And he has a lot of depth to him, but you don't get to see it very often in the actual game and like session to session.
Do we need to
I
get him to sign a permission slip before we talk about him?
I think it's applicable, and we could always, walk back certain statements that are made. I'm not saying anything derogatory about Thor, but there are times where Thor's player, we have a group Discord that, we help organize the game and keep notes and passings back and forth. In that Discord, we have a channel that is dedicated to what are the characters doing between this session and next session, or what were they doing during the 5 days of travel that we didn't actually put on the books. And there has been multiple times that the player that plays Thor shows a deeper, more thoughtful side of that character that doesn't come up in the actual session. And whether that's because like he now has time to really think of a response, or having it written out allows him to see a point or follow a point through, it is fun, or honestly inspiring, to use maybe a potentially over exaggerated term, to see that side of his character, because we don't get a lot of it in the game. So that would be kind of what you're speaking of, taking someone who either is hesitant to roleplay or doesn't enjoy like going all into like a goofy voice or being in character at the table, allowing them to take their own time and their own space and their own head to put out a thoughtful version of who their character is might surprise you as to what's kind of below the surface or hiding in the background most of the time.
What, as from the DM side, what are you what are you looking for in a logistical sense, or what do you feel like you need to do to be prepared?
Ooh, that's a difficult question. And I think some of it's not going to apply to everybody because our game is rather serious. I would imagine more serious than most other games. It is initially somewhat daunting to have all these other plates up in the air as you are still running the game. I find myself, whenever we do a write up or an interaction, when we cover some lore bit or we have some mention of like another character that we haven't really touched on in a while, like feeling a bit of panic, like, oh, do I have this right? Did I get the dates right? Did I, represent them correctly? Because usually in our write ups, we're touching on people that we haven't given a lot of screen time to otherwise. And while that is interesting to see those different characters, or like mess with people in like the caravan who's otherwise just a blank NPC, it adds to the load of trying to keep all these different personalities kind of present in your mind. But I think with people that run a more relaxed game or aren't so precise about like not wanting to mess up their lore or override something they've already said, you really could just go into it with a bit more like levity or enjoyment versus feeling a bit more weighed down by it. But to try and actually concisely answer your question, all that I'm really looking for is to let the player kick around in their sandbox and get what they are looking for out of it, which in a broader sense, is my goal with every session that we play in the game as a whole. Have the players and the characters actually go after what they're looking for and seeing that and having fun.
So what what do you do, or what do you know you could do to avoid this adding uh, a lot of extra prep time, because prep time is one of the big
Mhm.
concerns for a DM.
If that is a like big concern for you, then you could just constrict these write-ups or these in-depth, I don't know, interactions of your characters to really non-essential things, right? Them just interacting with a shopkeeper or having a dialogue with an established character on the road and just not really meaningfully adding to the story or the lore or the actions that are coming up so that you don't have to worry about it impacting the game. I, to an extent, try to keep this in mind. There isn't a lot of really big story beats that we either progress or cover in our write ups most of the time. But if that is something that, is daunting or something you don't want to deal with on a regular basis, then just make it a light interaction that's still meaningful to the player and still adds to the world at large, but doesn't add to the prep time that is such a monster to most people.
I think it's also from my side. I start one of these interludes, is the word I keep using, with an idea. Like it's not just, all right, let's write this week's description of what them sitting around the campfire is like. I have a specific conversation that I think would be interesting or dramatic, or a specific character that I want to talk to more. Um, and I'm starting from an actual idea. It's not just getting together the rest of the week to write about, what they're eating, uh, and stuff like that. It's not minutia. So there's no bookkeeping. It's sort of like we're writing our own fan fiction.
Yeah.
Given that, like, the kind of topics that are covered and the situations that are uh, a little more subdued, or a little more calm. Like, no monsters have been fought or treasure found, or anything like that. In the pure, like, D&D gameplay sense, the game has not progressed, but the narrative has. So if you have a game where the narrative is very important to the group, or is a big part of the fun, if you have some really big fans of your characters and your world, then yeah, you can write your own fan fiction. It makes it real. Like, I vastly prefer this to writing the backstory. In fact, as a side note, I think this is probably a superior way to do a backstory. Before the campaign has even started, get together with the DM and literally write the backstory back and forth. I could write stuff about my own character all night, but it's not real unless the creator of the universe gives it the stamp of approval.
Yeah,
Uh,
true enough.
so now I get to establish things with the DM that are true, in you know in our fiction. The canon. The word is canon. It's canon.
That yeah, I think it's a really appropriate way of contextualizing it is you are writing fan fiction and then I guess the original author is waving their magic wand and bringing it into canon. It honestly would be a rather fun way to do a character's backstory, though it would be a lot more involved than usually just asking someone to bring stuff to you. Because I think it touches on, again, that concept of when one person is dictating every decision, like doing your own write-up or kind of mulling over your own character's intentions and ideas, you only have one perspective. You only have one way to attack that problem or that idea. But when you add even just a second opinion to the mix or just another person to sound off of, it not only makes it real in a canon sense, but makes it real in like a resonating with yourself kind of feeling or degree. And I think that's more what I imagined you got out of it versus like progressing things, right? Like I knew that you'd come to each write up with an idea or with a certain intent in mind, and I thought that my job was mainly just placating that idea, getting it fleshed out, and like letting you, I guess, like mold it with my supervision. But I think it more comes down to getting an interaction with somebody else that you couldn't have achieved otherwise, which might
Right.
be the better way to kind of approach it going forward.
So, from a mechanical sense, there's been very few. I think I've volunteered some dice rolls
Hmm.
uh from from my end, which is
Hmm.
actually uh it's not actually the best etiquette. The DM should be the one calling for dice rolls, but you and I have we're on the same wavelength,
I have
and
a
I
hot take, not to interrupt you. I've heard advice before that players should be the one that dictate when they roll a check. Like, I will roll athletics to attempt this versus the DM asking for an athletics. And again, this could be its whole other topic. But I love that initiative, right? Like, there's been times in our game where something happens and you already have rolled intimidation. And I'm like, perfect. I think it helps keep things flowing better and also allows the game mechanics to mold with the narrative really well. Didn't mean to interrupt you there, but that's a hot take that we're certainly going to cover at some point. So,
that's yeah, that'll be another video, I guess. So, but
mhm.
check with your DM. Your mileage may vary.
Yeah.
Anyway, during some of these, I've volunteered some dice rolls because it felt appropriate because I was actually trying to use an ability
Hmm.
or influence the character in a pretty specific way.
Hmm.
But they've been few and far between. And maybe we can talk about what role the actual mechanics of the game can have. If you feel like that's important, good uses of dice rolls and abilities and what makes sense. We've already talked about how like there's no so far there hasn't been any combat
Hmm.
in game terms. There've been social encounters.
Hmm.
You could do combat, but it would have to be purely for a narrative purpose.
Yeah.
That would be really weird if you showed up at the next session and it's like, yeah, I'm down. I had a fight
Yeah.
go bad while we were apart.
Hmm.
You guys have
I
to come find me.
So the initial way that I would try and introduce this to people as a concept or as a group that doesn't usually do stuff like this is I might get this wrong, but if I remember correctly, the DMG includes a lot of tables for downtime and certain activities you can take, and what that looks like and how it looks. I just said the same thing twice. But if I remember correctly, and I may be getting this wrong, it also includes tables for like what degree of success you manage or what problems or implications show up as you're going about your downtime. Some of them make you like spend a certain amount of gold or like get a level of exhaustion, things of that nature. That would be how I would begin baby stepping yourself into something like this. And that already is using dice rolls and mechanics to guide the narrative where otherwise you as a writer or a player or a character would have to make those decisions balance as you possibly could. The example that we've done that I would use is the vision that you had where I asked you for a list of dice rolls, basically wrote that narrative for me. I just made a little line or a scoreboard, so to speak. Here's what happens. If it goes good, this is what progresses. If it goes bad, here's how this progresses. And then I just took your dice roll, which was a mixture of like dexterity saves and wisdom checks, and I think like attack rolls as well.
Force of attacks, yeah.
Yeah, and then I just used that to guide, how successful you were, how it looked, or, how far you managed to get. And it ultimately also dictated what the outcome was, like what actual benefit or reward you got from it, where it was a sliding scale of not getting a message at all to getting a more clear and decisive message. That would be my favorite application of using mechanics in this kind of, we really should come up with a term, but I keep using write up, is if you find yourself lacking in the decisiveness to like figure out how successful one person is or, how far they can get in a, I don't know, a story beat that they're kind of like trying to track down or explore, just use pretty loose dice rolls. The exception that I would point out, and this I think is a pretty understood ruling for most D&D tables and games, is if a character is set upon succeeding at a task and has like an unlimited amount of time or a reasonable amount of time to keep trying at this task, there's no real need for a dice roll. You could potentially flavor it as, oh, you try for hours and hours and hours and finally succeed. But if you're telling a story, it's usually a lot easier to simply go, you know, you've done this a million times. You're just asking for directions. I don't need you to roll an insight check to see if the directions are good or not. So I would use your common sense like you would as a DM in a game and ask for dice rolls where you think they apply and let them fly or be loose where they don't.
This is a great opportunity for one of my favorite house rules, which is if the stakes are not super high, if they're not life and death, then maybe it's enough for the character to just have proficiency.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're doing an interlude is the word I keep coming back to, um, or using your real life downtime for game downtime. If your character is being stealthy in one of these situations, if they're proficient in stealth and they probably wouldn't end up locked up or killed if they got caught anyway, so they're, the consequences of failure are not game changing,
Mm-hmm.
then that could be something else that you could consider. You're proficient, so you'll get there.
Yeah.
Versus you're trying to do something that you're not proficient in, so you get a one shot at beginner's luck, and if you don't make it, this is going to go a different way. As a player, that was pretty exciting because we hadn't even talked about it yet.
Mm-hmm.
What that scene was going to be. You just asked me on Discord for this list of like 8 different roles, and I knew something crazy was coming. So that was exciting to uh, anticipate that.
This topic really only involves DMs and players that are truly invested and are already at a level with each other where they want more, where you're leaving a session wanting to continue, wanting to progress, wanting to explore the world in a more meaningful way. It's not for players that are, barely keeping notes or barely show up or kind of, forget major plot details occasionally. You do have to find the right people to apply it with, but once you do, it is immensely fulfilling.
I think a good example, I sent you a message on Discord and I said, I'm going to a brothel.
Yep, I remember
And you
that.
were like, okay.
Mm-hmm.
I think that you knew that I was not asking you for ERP
Mm-hmm.
based on our established relationship at that
Mm-hmm.
point. Um,
But now, however, I just know that it's just asked for subtly.
no, but just yeah, I'm going to a brothel. It's
Mhm.
gonna be dramatic. It's good. There's gonna be character development. Um, it's actually completely safe for work. For the record, to your point, there's a level of respect for our own characters and our own story that already exists. Like probably this may not also be the easiest thing to start with a brand new group. This came about. We started really doing this habitually after we had already been playing for months.
Yeah, at least a couple months, probably.
For the players that don't, for whatever reason, it's not for everybody, and it's not a slight if it isn't. But for the players that this is not fun for them or they're not that interested, how do you involve players that do find it fun without making the members of the group that aren't doing this kind of thing between sessions start to feel like NPCs in their own game or like second bananas?
That's a really nuanced part of the conversation that I don't think I've really even pinned down fully yet. I imagine that it's a pretty common situation in people's games where you have players of varying seriousness or involvement, where you might have one or two players that are just like ravenous for D&D and the game and the content you provide. You might also have two or three players that are just kind of showing up to check the box and then going about their lives. And to be clear, neither of those ways are wrong or right or better or worse. They are just two different ways of approaching a hobby that is vast in how you can play it and how you can enjoy it, right? Whenever you give D&D advice, or whenever I give D&D advice, which is rare, I try to make that abundantly clear that I don't judge anything with an iron fist besides like really extreme actions like being an absolute degenerate at a table or throwing the whole story out of whack for your own sake. Those things are pretty full stop bad and not, a good way to play D&D. But as far as the reasonable approaches to this hobby, that's something that I don't think you can ever fully get around. Because, again, using our game as an example, because something that I'm going to find a limiting in these discussions is the only long-term game, the only meaningful D&D game I've played in is this game. So all of my advice and my perspective is coming from this one very lengthy example. I'll give myself at least that. There are players in our game that don't engage at the same level as you and I. And that's not bad and that's not wrong, but there are times where they miss certain smaller beats that like were mentioned in a write-up or were discussed about out of character or were maybe just very briefly referred to at one point, and now it's becoming a bit more focused. And I don't think you're ever going to fully cure that problem. The best solution that I would try and am actively kind of trying now is keeping up a group discussion throughout the week that is driven by the players and not the DM. Because, at least from my perspective, trying to be inside the player's head, if I start off each week, we play our games on Sunday, so Monday morning I wake up and I type a message, "Hello, everybody, here's your homework for the week. Get back to me with all these details I want." It comes off less inviting than if a player is like, "Yay, there was this cool thing said last week, or there's this cool thing coming up. Let's, talk about that." That would be the best way to include people that are a bit more passive in the game, because it's, I don't know, a bit more natural thing to shoot the shit with your friends, to just discuss a hobby that you both enjoy. Whether or not the energy levels are matched, you're at least involving someone who otherwise would be fully removed from the more in-depth stuff that we kind of get into. If that rant at some point answered a question.
Yeah, I think that from the player side of things, um, there are things that a player can do about this too.
Hmm.
If you really want to be a good player in your group and add to the group, um, you don't need to leave it all to the DM either. You can be a co-conspirator. You can, um, we were the first ones in our group to do this, and we did a couple of these downtimes, and then shared with the whole group to read, and that got everybody sort of interested. And once they saw what it was, then I, as a player, could go to another player and say, well, our characters had this conflict during the session. Let's play that out. Our guys go for a drink and hash this out. And then we'll give it to the rest of the group before the next session. That's another useful side note, probably, is that it's best done in situations when the group has split up for some reason.
Hmm.
You don't want to be at a situation where you're trying to include characters whose players cannot participate.
Yeah, yeah.
That probably goes without saying, but just in
Hmm.
case, this is really good for everybody else went to bed, but our characters
Hmm.
sat up around the fire or went out drinking together or whatever.
To bounce off your point real quick, I think it is criminally underrated or unrepresented. If that's a correct term. the fallout of events, right? Like in D&D, a lot of the time you get to see the actual like climax of something, like killing a whole cave of goblins or shouting down someone or winning one over on the villain, right? But it's very rare that you pay that same attention and mind to what happens after the fact, right? Like you're injured and recovering, or your feelings or emotions are still, heightened after this somewhat traumatic or impactful event. What does that look like? And that's a really cool thing to delve into, but I don't think D&D covers all that often, at least not in everyone's kind of standard play.
I see a lot of discussion about sort of the morality and the ethics of being adventurers in really hardcore corners of the D&D community. There's a
Mhm.
lot of discussion about like, are all goblins evil?
Mhm.
Should we find out before we kill them all?
Yep.
That kind of thing, or other situations that you might be in. And being an adventurer there would result in a lot of trauma and inner conflict and um personal consequences, and you watched your party member do something really unexpected, and now you're questioning, like, is how is my character going to continue traveling with this character? And this is a way to actually answer those questions without just sitting around thinking about, what do I think about goblins? Can goblins be
Mhm.
good? Figure it out in character, talk about it.
You
Get the
touched on
cleric.
something that I think is really interesting to point out. You can almost use these as a band-aid in some applications where, let's say, a player makes a choice in the game that a lot of the other players in the group don't agree with, and you have to somehow find a way for everyone to come to terms with it so you can progress the story, because at the end of the day, putting the group on a path forward is more important than a lot of other things. You can use something like this where if a character is really adamantly against another character's decision, this can be a way for them to sit down and come to terms or explain their side, and you would get natural character development and growth from that and solve a problem that otherwise would have to be hashed out outside of the game or before a game or instead of the game. So,
Hand waved away, maybe.
yeah, hand waved away a lot of the time, I would imagine. So,
Another common unwritten rule is not for player characters not to use the social skills on each other,
mhm,
like persuasion and intimidation and things of that nature.
mhm.
This is something that you can do instead. Instead of trying to flip a switch to make the lawful good paladin go along with the outlaw plan, convince him.
Mhm.
Have that conversation between sessions. Include your DM so the DM knows what to plan for.
Yeah. I've found as we've been discussing this, so many other topics that lead into this or are needed to have a base understanding to kind of accomplish this conversation. So perhaps it was a bit ambitious as our first charge into the fray, but it touches on a lot. And I think that's why it's interesting to go back and forth on is there's so many different ways to interpret this or to imply this or to consume this. If you're, again, one of the players that isn't actively going after this, it will certainly lead into other discussions whenever we get more and more of these episodes out, and hopefully at least gets people asking questions about the various things we touch on, right? Like if they're coming away from this listening experience not with the tools to start typing out these long monologues and going back and forth with their DM, at least if they're leaving this going, huh, I wonder if I can, get Timmy to set aside a day and, talk about it or chat about it or write out some quick blurbs, or, maybe there is an avenue that I'm not pursuing or not thinking about, or the fallout of a situation that I'm not really dealing with as a character. That's at least useful, and I'll take that as a win if people think more about their characters and the game at large and getting a bit more immersed, because being immersed as a player does wonders to giving the DM some fuel, some excitement to keep going. Because if you show interest, that's all, as far as me being a DM, that's all that I want to see. And this, these whole interludes and write-ups and stuff of that nature is probably the most condensed, like pure IV in my vein way of being like, I'm interested. I'm loving what I'm seeing and I want more of it. And it helps me get excited to make the next session and to keep the story going. So, if nothing else, I'd take that away from this conversation.
And don't be intimidated either. Don't,
Mm-hmm.
you don't have to be a great writer. You don't have
Mm-hmm.
to be a great role player. You don't have to have done anything like this before.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't have to be novellas. We're
Yeah.
talking about, for us, it usually ends up being these pretty long form things
Mm-hmm.
because we're mega nerds. But there is no reason why it can't be glorified text messaging between
I mean, that's what
sessions.
it started out with us, like
Yeah.
going back and forth with quick blurbs of how does this work, what do you think about this, etc.
Especially for, in the beginning or with somebody that's new to the game,
Mm-hmm.
or new to this kind of narrative focus. You don't have to have real high expectations for yourself. You don't have to channeling the spirit of J.R.R. Tolkien in order to make this fun.
Mm-hmm.
Just try it. Just say yes. See what happens.
I mean, everything that you pursue in this game should be with the understanding that it brings like fun and enjoyment. I sometimes hate using the term fun because not everything should be fun. It should deepen your understanding or kind of like scratch an itch that you need, right? There are things that are challenging and frustrating that at the time aren't fun, but when you accomplish them are a lot more meaningful and bring a bit more perspective into your life. Again, this is a game, so it's a little bit high horse to say like it does all these glorious things. That's again probably another discussion. One of the minor things we didn't really talk about is how you can effectively use it to take situations that in the game would waste time or not be handled correctly in the game and have it in a like a bubble where you can control that aspect and also make game time more group orientated versus like an individual moment.
I feel like, again, the thing that we're going to link, the story we're going to link, is another
Mm-hmm.
great example.
Mm-hmm.
If I stopped our session on a Sunday night halfway through
Mm-hmm.
and looked into this camera and said, Valoran's going to a brothel, chaos would ensue, and
Mm-hmm.
my intentions, his thinking, what he's going through as a character in that moment, why he's doing it, would all go out the window,
Mm-hmm.
and the session would devolve, uh, inevitably into
I want to be
some
a snake. I want to sneak in. What is he doing? Is the woman hot that he's with? Yeah,
right.
yeah,
I'm gonna go too, and
yeah, yeah.
all that kind of stuff. And I
Mm-hmm.
knew I knew why he was going, and I knew that he didn't want anybody else to go with him. He didn't
Mm-hmm.
want anybody else to know he was going.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's not a great thing to do in session, to monopolize the DM
Mm-hmm.
and take something that is going to take a while and say, you guys are not coming. You're left out.
Mm-hmm.
And all because I have a tone that I'm going for, and I know that's the only way I can get it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I knew the only way to do it was in between session, and then we could share the results afterward.
Unless you have the perfect group, it is near impossible to have the sole focus on one character and keeping the entire party or the entire group interested in what's going on. There are times you can manage that when, a big giant story beat's kind of coming to a head, but there are so many like horror stories that I've heard and games that I've been involved in where one person again is monopolizing not only the DM's time but the game's time, which to some of the other players might be a lot more precious than this person's, kind of dicking about that they want to do. So this is a really easy way to separate that out and to allow that player to get indulgent in whatever they want to do, but keeping the game focused on the group. This is probably another thing that we could talk about again, but doing like shopping and various upkeep kind of related stuff is way more useful to keep in the background or outside of session versus in session. If you spend hours bartering with some kobold over a magical artifact that you never actually end up buying, you are literally just throwing game time out the window. There's no benefit to the story, there's no progression being made. I'm sure the other players are sitting there bored and kind of frustrated. So, yes, this is a very good tool, not only in a narrative sense or a write up sense or having these whole little stories written out, but keeping the game focused on the group and flowing and using the game time to the best of your ability while at the table.
And it's an outlet
Hmm.
for embracing main character syndrome
Hmm.
and getting that maybe out of your system, in a sense.
Hmm.
Um, there may be never actually looked up what the accepted definition of main character syndrome is. I'm just operating off of context clues.
Hmm.
But it lets a player be the main character guilt-free without disrupting the larger game.
Hmm.
Um, and in a way that can be managed and still additive to the overall campaign.
So, to attempt to actually bring this conversation to some sort of conclusion, being the player of this dialogue and being more of that perspective, what would be maybe your top three things that you would recommend or advise or pass on to a player interested in including this or struggling to include this?
First thing that pops into my head is to think about who your character actually is. This is a good time to it, especially if you haven't before. This is how you can start thinking about their personality, their wants, their likes, their dislikes, their motivations, the stuff that goes beyond their stats. A great shortcut would be to find one of the many uh, character development questionnaires that people have written on D&D forums and shared, and answer those for yourself. So go into it with some sense of who your character is, and then you can continue to develop it, this way, and have an idea, uh, other than ideally, other than we are going out for drinks,
Hmm.
or we're around the campfire for breakfast again. Uh, those are perfectly good settings, but if you think about it again in a literary sense, or in like a, if you think about your favorite movies or TV shows, the scene in the bar is not about drinking.
Hmm.
There's something else happening in that dialogue between the characters or within the character. So try to have some sense of what that might be before you get started, or else it's going to be a lot of tedium.
It's almost like if Obi-Wan and Luke Skywalker sat down with Han Solo and Chewbacca, and for the rest of the movie they just shot the shit and had drinks and told stories and actually didn't do anything or agree to anything.
Right, right.
Hmm.
This isn't uh you're still trying to, it's not just D&D reality TV,
Hmm.
which reality TV isn't even reality TV, but never mind.
Yeah.
Um have an idea. Maybe not necessarily a goal. That might be too strong of a word, but a direction
Hmm.
that you want to go in.
Direction's a
So
good term.
that's two. And three, have some commitment. When you I if you detected a note of sarcasm in my voice earlier when I was complaining about people who talk about being busy adults and I just don't have time, I think that you choose things that matter to you and
Hmm.
you do them or you don't. And I think 9 times out of 10, what that person is saying is not, "Oh, I'm just so busy." What they're actually saying, the subtext is, D&D with you guys isn't actually that important to me. watching football or grilling hamburgers or going shopping is more important to me than D&D. I one of my primary hobbies has bumped this one this
Hmm.
week. If you know that you are going to have the week from hell, maybe put it on the back burner, you know?
Hmm.
You don't need to start it this week, but once you do start it, it's best if you can commit to keeping it moving, keeping that ball rolling, because you don't want to still be working on something that happened last year in game time, and now it doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah.
Um, so have have some sense of like I'm gonna look in on this every night between now and the next session just to see if it's time for me to add something, and just be considerate of people's time and effort.
I will put as a little addendum to your, I guess, declaration there.
My mini
It's
rant.
Yeah, it's not bad to have other hobbies that take priority over D&D. I think where the issue lies is you as a person have to understand where your commitments are, and you have to also understand the seriousness or the level of energy of the person you are dealing with. And if you know that it's not going to match up or that you're going one way is going to disappoint the other, you have to know that and understand that. And if you can work around it, great. But if it's going to become a point of friction, then it's best to just not put that out there, to just understand that it isn't going to work and keep moving forward.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the point is not to put down people
Hmm.
for having other hobbies. It's be honest with yourself, be honest with your group,
Hmm.
uh, and finish what you start.
That is how you should approach any sort of advice, and particularly this, I guess, talking segment, is only go after it if it's fun, if it brings you more understanding or joy, if it adds to the game, if it adds to the group's enjoyment. That should be kind of the filter you put everything through before trying to apply it. And if it doesn't work and it's not fun and you're finding that it's just more of a headache or a hassle or frustrating than helpful, then you don't need it.
Going back through this, we'll have to note like the other 10 episodes that we just pitched,
Yeah.
which I knew was going to happen.
Or if there is a viewing audience still listening, comment down below what you would like for us to discuss next week. But I guess that will bring the first episode of Natural 2 to a conclusion. Are there any departing words you have for our viewing audience, sir?
If you clicked on this, thanks. If you are one of the people that have already been following Asmilia's adventures, thank you. Share this with other people you know that like D&D. We are putting ourselves out there in a way that is new. This is not the same as just posting our recorded game sessions. We're creating a new commitment to another facet of how we enjoy our hobby with you, dear viewer.
Precisely. Yes, the 5% of you that are still listening, the channel is full of his millionth adventures, the long-term campaign that we are both a part of, and we are also attempting to branch out to other tabletop role-playing nerdy, I guess, avenues, map making discussions, and hopefully after this week's episode there will be a backlog of other topics that we might discuss and converse about. I don't pretend to be a D&D genius or having the most experience in the world, but if some of my ramblings can assist in guiding another conversation or at least putting some thoughts in your head, I will take that as a small victory.
So will I.
Adios.
Until next time.